pray and give thanks to God because we've discovered this benevolent Creator, how would we know that we're supposed to pray 5 times a day, as it is required in the Quran? Or how would we know the direction of prayer is Mecca? So Revelation tells us things we couldn't have otherwise known, but having discovered them, we find these reasonable. It's not unreasonable to pray 5 times a day, except in this culture. But so he would continue in this vein and say, the Mutazilite school emphasized God's rationality and his justice, and we have just touched upon the rationality side. On the justice side, they said, man must be able, through his reason, to come to an understanding of what is good and what is evil, of what is just and unjust. And this isn't something just Muslims can do. All men can, through their reason, come to an understanding of what is moral and what is immoral. Otherwise, how could they be held to account for choosing what is good and avoiding what is evil, unless they could come to know this? In addition to which, they must be free to choose. Otherwise, if God punished them for doing something in which they had no choice, God would be what? He'd be a tyrant. He'd be unjust. We couldn't have a God like this. Therefore, these Mutazilites were known as the proponents of God's rationality and his justice. And intricate to that idea of justice was man's free will and reason's capability of coming to know morality. In the 9th century, Caliph al-Ma'mun, the greatest sponsor of philosophy and Greek thought in the history of Islam, embraced the Mutazilite school of thought, and he sponsored it. And al-Ma'mun is said to have had a dream in which Aristotle appeared to him. And he asked Aristotle, what is the good? And Aristotle answered, it is what is rationally good. Therefore, al-Ma'mun embraced this response, embraced the Mutazilites, and sponsored the first Arab philosopher by the name of al-Kindi. al-Jabbar said, because of the status and priority of reason in this theology, quote, it is obligatory for you to carry out what accords with reason, unquote. It's obligatory for you to carry out what accords with reason. Does any of this sound familiar? I should add also that the Mutazilites did another startling thing. They said the Quran did not exist co-eternally with Allah. They said the Quran was created in time. Yes, it was the divine word of God, but it was given to specific people at a specific time in history, in certain conditions, all of which you had to come to understand if you wanted to understand the revelation. It didn't exist co-eternally on a tablet in heaven with Allah. And therefore, the door for interpretation was much broader than it was for those people who said the Quran existed co-eternally with God. Now, al-Ma'mun embraced this teaching. He sponsored it. He made it a state doctrine that the Quran had been created. And anyone who said that the Quran existed eternally couldn't be a judge or a witness in a trial. He also made it a state doctrine that man has free will. And there was a good deal of opposition to this doctrine. He is the one who created the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Have you ever heard of the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah? This is the great translation center in the first half of the 9th century in Baghdad that obtained the manuscripts of Plato and Socrates and all the great thinkers. And he hired all these Nestorian Christians to translate these texts into Arabic. So this became a great center for study and scholarship, and scholars from all over the world would come to the Beit al-Hikmah. When you hear people refer to the golden age of Islam, this is what they're talking about. al-Mamun, the Beit al-Hikmah, the Mutazilites. When Benedict XVI talked about the de-Hellenization of Islam, this was the Hellenization of Islam. This is when it began absorbing the Hellenic influences that had affected Christianity many centuries before. So if this sounds familiar to you, it does so for a very good reason. It's the product of the same influences. Now, the second school of Muslim theology arose in direct opposition to every tenet held by the Mutazilites. And these were called the Ash'arites, named after al-Ash'ari, who had been a Mutazilite and at age 40 stood up and said, I abjure Mutazilism. I deny the Quran was created. It was co-eternal. I deny. And he went down the list of everything they believe. And the Ash'arites, the school of theology named after him, became known as the proponents of God's omnipotence and will. God was not rationality and justice. He was pure will and power. Unbound by anything. Unconstrained by anything. They were furious that the Mutazilites would try to limit God's action through some conception of justice. God is above any conception of justice. God is above or without reason. As Ibn Hazm said, and as was quoted by the Pope in the Regensburg lecture, God is not bound by his own word. They were highly offended that the Mutazilites had said that man, through reason, can come to know what is good and evil, just and unjust. They said this knowledge is unavailable to man. Why can't man come to know what's good and what is evil? Well, al-Ghazali, perhaps the greatest Ash'arite thinker, and a Muslim to this day who is held to be the second most important, next only to Muhammad, al-Ghazali, said, first of all, your reason cannot be relied upon because it is totally subject to your self-interest. You'll find good, whatever is in your interest, and you'll say evil are those things against your interest. But there's a far more important reason. And the reason is that nothing is good or evil in and of itself. All acts are neutral. They're neither good nor evil, but that God says so, one way or another. There's a famous question posed in the Euthyphro, in which they say, do the gods love piety because it's good, or is it good because they love it? And so the Ash'arites ask, does God forbid murder because it's evil, or is it evil because he forbids it? They decisively answered this question by saying, it is only evil because he forbids it. And were he to say otherwise, it would become incumbent upon us to engage in murder. Is lying evil in itself? No. It's only evil because Allah has said not to lie. And he may change his mind and make lying obligatory, in which case it would become moral and incumbent upon you to lie. Nothing is good or evil in and of itself. Now, there is another reason for this that is a result of the metaphysics they constructed to justify their conception of God as pure will and absolute power. They said, for God to be omnipotent, nothing else can be so much as potent. There can be no secondary causes. There can only be the primary cause. God is the primary cause. There are no secondary causes in the natural world. What do we mean by that? What just happened there? Why did the pen fall? Gravity. You have all just committed the sin of shirk. The sin of shirk is comparing something to God. And you have just said gravity